The course of Biblical Typology, Part 2, A Brief History and Boundaries. The Scriptures contain enormous, unimaginable revelations for an honest and attentive reader. This cycle is somewhat academic, and it is intended to help readers of the Holy Scriptures acquire the basic theological tool necessary for reliable, systematic personal reading and study of Scripture. In the previous part of this series, we started talking about typology. This tool was not made by theologians, but was given to us by God and revealed many times in the Scriptures. The boundaries of the typology. The name typology itself comes from the Greek word tupos and means archetype, model. This is a well-known concept among theologians. Typology was the most ancient, biblical, legitimate, and traditional method of theological interpretation. However, apart from its limited place in the narrow field of Christology, the method has been largely ignored by Christian theologians. Let me explain that in Christology, that is, the science of Christ, the Old Testament messiahs, saviors, anointed ones, such as judges, kings, prophets, or priests, and prophetic events models of the Old Testament pointed to Christ the Messiah. This is how Jesus Christ himself understands and interprets the Old Testament, as he sees himself in it. But typology is not limited to this. Unfortunately, theologians are limited to this. Following the prophecies of the Old Testament, Jesus Christ spoke about the future history of the people of God and about the destinies of various nations, as it is presented in the Scriptures. Laying the foundation for a new Israel, which is the Christian church, Jesus predicted a historical path for this new Israel that was surprisingly typologically similar to the history of the Old Testament Israel. And this was especially true of the events of the last days, or the Lord's Day, as the Scriptures call this time. Typology shines brightly on every page of the New Testament, sending us back to the events of the past in order to understand the prophecies about the future and about our future in particular. This is a historical typology of sacred history. We will discover a whole world by consistently applying the typology of the sacred history of Israel to the history of the new Israel, the Christian kingdom. The typology will be restored to its rightful place so that it can be used as intended to provide different theological perspectives on each specific biblical text. When this is done correctly, the typological perspectives of the text come to an inner agreement, and we have a real, vivid, and multidimensional living picture, the truth that the Word and the Spirit have presented to us. When you see this and take it into account in your personal research of the prophecies of the Bible, your research will reach a new level. About the history of typology. The authors of the New Testament make extensive use of typology in their writings, pointing to a new, more complete, and more perfect fulfillment of the types of the Old Testament. Within the framework of the New Testament and the new history that is opened, it is widely accepted that the New Testament Church, or New Israel, can be seen as the embodied prototype of the Old Testament of carnal Israel. The typology was already known among the first Christians, and then there is, as strictly speaking, theology. Both events, past and present or future, are historical, and both are represented in Scripture. One of the goals of the typology for Christians was to demonstrate that the ministry of Jesus and the first coming were predicted and known in advance, and the Gospels do contain many prophecies of the Old Testament that were fulfilled in the life of Christ, as well as quotations from the Old Testament, which directly and indirectly connect Jesus with the Old Testament prophecies. As Eric Auerbach notes in his essay entitled The Figure in Early Christianity, it was typology that was the most influential method of interpreting the Old Testament, at least at the time when Christianity was spreading among the peoples of the Mediterranean, as well as in Northern and Western Europe. Auerbach notes that this method was dominant in understanding the Old Testament until the Reformation. That is, the Old Testament texts were interpreted as figura rerum, translated as a reproduction of a figure or a phenomenal prophecy. Typological interpretation was a key element of medieval realism and remained significant in Europe until the 18th century. However, with the era of modernism, typology has receded into the background. The Eastern Orthodox Church has largely preserved the typological method due to the fact that this church has always paid great attention to continuity in the presentation of doctrine in all historical periods, and typology is still a universal and frequent exegetical tool of the Eastern Orthodox Church. About the spontaneous typology and systematic approach, many Christian historical researchers have made typological comparisons between biblical events and events that took place in the course of history, rather intuitively than on the basis of a systematic assessment. They also try to assess the meaning of a historical event. One of the most striking examples of this is the traditional comparison of the Avignon captivity and its designation as the Babylonian captivity of the Church. Both events are historical, and both are caused by the apostasy of God's people. This logic can be traced in the sermons, as many preachers find parallels between biblical events and events in the history of the Church. Since there is no systematic approach, these attempts can hardly rise above general allegories. There is not always an indisputable relationship between type and antitype in such spontaneous approaches. Nevertheless, there are some truly valuable findings, although they are not based on a systematic approach. The Puritans, for example, interpreted their history typologically, considering themselves typologically consistent with the Israelites' exodus from Egypt. They thus applied the typology both to similar spiritual experiences and to real historical events. Unfortunately, this intuitive approach remains undeveloped, and he mostly limited himself to private conclusions and assessments that people made using the method of typological perspectives that had not yet been formed. Here is another example. David Whitford, in his book The Papal Antichrist or Martin Luther, and the underappreciated influence of Lorenzo Valla, noted that the Protestant Reformation asserted the thesis that the Roman Catholic Church is Babylon, that is, the antitype of the Old Testament city and state, notorious for its mixture of true and false religion and oppressing the people of God. This typological interpretation did not come with the Reformation, but actually preceded it. However, in the absence of any clear guidelines, we will wander through history in a daze, following our own interests and emotions. Thus, we are faced with a choice. Either we must recognize that comparing events and trends in the history of the Church with biblical events can only be accepted as a form of allegory and treated as purely illustrative material, or we must try to identify principles, if any, that would allow us to trace a typological correlation. That's what we're going to do in this cycle, and we're going to do it systematically from the first lines of Scripture. Be patient. Step by step, we will acquire what Philippe Nizier talked about. I've already quoted this quote in a previous post, but let me repeat myself. You've probably noticed the details that sometimes abound in the facts described in the Holy Scriptures, the meaning of which, it would seem, is completely secondary, both from a philosophical point of view and from a historical one, whereas other scriptures describing important events in the history of nations have not received a similar development. We should not forget that all the elements of sacred knowledge and supernatural knowledge are hidden in minor details. However, the initiates were instructed, and they still observe it, to conceal these details so that they would not be misused, whose desire for God has not reached a level that would guarantee the discreet, prudent, and beneficial use of this knowledge, authority, and the opportunities they provide, and which should be used only for the glorification of God and love for one's neighbor.